Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. If we truly want to understand the ancient Roman world, we've kind of got to look past the grand narratives of emperors, marching legions, and massive marble monuments. Today, we're going to reconstruct a living, breathing civilization through the grit and the rhythm of everyday existence. We're talking about the labor, the incredible sensory overload, the social customs, and those deeply communal rituals of survival. Let's step back in time and experience a typical Roman day, from dawn to dusk.
Picture this. You're waking up in a sprawling, densely packed metropolis that is largely devoid of artificial light. There's maybe just the faint, smoky flicker of an expensive oil lamp here and there. In this world, the shifting sun absolutely dictates human existence. The very second the sun crests the horizon, citizens are plunged into these noisy, bustling, vibrant streets. Their day didn't begin with the harsh ringing of a mechanical alarm clock. It began with the very first rays of dawn. That morning light literally synchronized the biological and economic pulse of the entire empire.
Section 1. The Roman Workday. So for the elite patricians, the morning always kicked off with the salutatio, these highly ritualized political greetings traded for loyalty. But for the ordinary laborer or craftsman, dawn meant an immediate descent into grueling physical toil. But here is the fascinating part. How long did they actually work? The Romans had a fundamentally different relationship with time than we do. They didn't use fixed 60-minute increments. Instead, they just divided the available daylight into 12 equal hours. Think about that for a second. Because daylight shifts throughout the year, the physical length of an hour actually expanded and contracted with the seasons. During the winter solstice, a single working hour compressed down to just 45 modern minutes, but by the summer solstice, it stretched to 75. Time itself was completely elastic.
Here's the absolute kicker. Regardless of the season, the grinding, back-breaking labor of the city met a hard limit at the 6th hour, which is our modern noon. By 12 p.m., the physical workday just ceased. It was over. Now, this historical reality really challenges our modern assumptions about constant, unending labor. The Romans recognized a firm, absolute boundary to the workday, which left the entire afternoon wide open for what they called otium, true leisure.
That brings us to Section 2. The mechanics of leisure.
Obviously, a civilization that just casually concludes its physical labor at noon is going to require some massive structural mechanisms to occupy the masses, right? Well, before the 7-day week was standardized, the Romans operated on the nundino cycle, which was an 8-day market week. For days A through G, agricultural labor absolutely dominated the rural landscape. But on the 8th day, the nundine, rural labor came to a complete halt. Farmers flocked into the urban centers to trade their goods, settle legal disputes, and actually socialize. It was essentially antiquity's earliest structural equivalent of a weekend. Furthermore, because they lacked statutory annual vacations, nobody was getting 2 weeks of paid time off. The populace relied heavily on state-sanctioned public holidays, or feria, to decompress. And there were 3 distinct flavors of these. You had the feria stativae, which were fixed annual festivals like the famous Saturnalia, then the feria conceptivae, which were movable feasts that shifted around based on the agricultural seasons. And finally, the feria imperativae. These were spontaneous, on-demand holidays declared by leaders for a massive military triumph, or sometimes just to appease the gods during a crisis. These festivals were absolutely crucial. They deeply embedded collective rest into the very fabric of their religious and civic life.
Section 3. The Afternoon Bath Ritual.
Right around the 8th Roman hour, which is roughly 2 p.m., citizens migrated en masse to the public baths. If you want to truly understand this incredibly vibrant atmosphere, we have to turn to the philosopher Seneca. The man literally lived directly above a bathhouse, and he left us this visceral, sensory account of the sheer chaos. He bitterly complained about the echoing sounds, the heavy grunts of straining weightlifters, the splashing of swimmers, the rhythmic smacking from the masseuses, and, my personal favorite, the shrill advertising cries of the armpit hair pluckers. It was unbelievably loud, suffocatingly humid, and just vibrantly alive.
Despite all that sensory overload, these baths were absolute marvels of engineering and social cohesion. They were powered by hypocaust heating technology, a genius system that circulated furnace exhaust through the floors and walls so they were literally warm to the touch. But beyond the tech, the baths were a uniquely classless environment. The entry fee was deliberately kept dirt cheap. This ensured that fabulously wealthy patricians and everyday ordinary plebs rubbed shoulders, exercised, and gossiped right side by side. It was an institutionalized social leveler in what was otherwise a highly stratified empire.
Moving on to Section 4, the theatrical spectacle.
After the baths, the afternoon naturally flowed toward the theater. This was a wildly emotional public spectacle, provided completely free of charge by the state to keep the populace happy, the legendary bread and circuses. And the Romans applied their trademark engineering genius here too, just to maximize comfort. Take the Valerium, for example. Imagine a massive canvas sail stretched completely over the open-air auditorium. It was actually maneuvered by teams of specially trained sailors who pulled on this complex rigging to protect the audience from the brutal Mediterranean sun, and made the whole spectacle this incredibly comfortable, immersive experience.
But hey, do not mistake that physical comfort for quiet contemplation. The atmosphere was a lot more like a rowdy, modern football stadium. Audiences were wildly expressive. They'd cheer at the top of their lungs or hurl fruit and stones if they thought a performance was garbage. Yet, there's this fascinating social paradox at play here. While the masses absolutely obsessed over these spectacles, the actors up on stage possessed a legal status barely above criminals and prostitutes. Performing literally meant sacrificing your civil rights. And that was true even as the biggest theater stars were quietly amassing massive fortunes and mingling with elite patrons behind the scenes.
And finally, Section 5. Taverns, Dice, and Dining.
As dusk finally starts to settle in, the public spectacles wrap up, and the citizens retreat into the winding city streets. The evening was completely dominated by an unsuppressed passion for gambling. Despite strict, repeated legal bans, men of literally all classes fervently played dice, known as alea, and board beams in the streets, in the military barracks, and in the taverns. This reveals a massive, glaring gap between rigid Roman law and everyday human behavior. The state constantly tried to legislate morality, but the cultural desire for the adrenaline rush of the dice was simply way too deeply rooted to ever eradicate.
So where did the ordinary citizen actually grab their evening meal? Well, usually at a local cook shop. Now, modern tourists and even some historians often use this snooty, erudite term, thermopolium, to describe Roman snack bars. But the archaeological and literary evidence tells a slightly different story. Thermopolium was actually an obscure joke coined by the comedic playwright Plautus. Actually, scratch that fancy term. Everyday Roman citizens simply called their local, street-level fast food joint a papina.
And dinner time brilliantly illuminates the stark, undeniable social divide of the empire. In the elite convivium, patricians reclined on plush couches at these highly exclusive, invite-only dinner parties. They were eating absurdly expensive, exotic foods, like stuffed dormice for crying out loud. It was a highly calculated, weaponized display of status and political networking. Meanwhile, over at the plebeian popina, ordinary workers stood shoulder to shoulder in open-air cookshops. They're eating simple, hot food ladled out of built-in masonry jars, knocking back cheap wine, and engaging in loud, rowdy socializing. It was literally two entirely different human worlds, occupying the exact same evening hours.
So, we want to leave you with this final thought. Today, we are so completely tethered to the relentless, ticking gears of a mechanical clock and the constant, draining demands of the modern grind. But as you reflect on the ancient Romans, their sun-dictated shifting hours, their heavy physical workdays that hard-stopped at noon, and their deeply communal systems of recreation, consider this. Does their ancient rhythm of survival and leisure hold a mirror up to our own modern exhaustion? Did they, perhaps, understand the human need for odium, for true restorative leisure, better than we do today? Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer. Keep questioning the past, because it's the absolute best way to understand our present.